Perfect. So thank you so much for joining. This is Ann Marie Wilcock, who works on behalf of UNICEF. So could you just briefly introduce yourself and the work you do with UNICEF and elaborate on what kinds of projects you're involved with?
Sure. So yeah, thanks for this conversation. So my name is Ann Marie Wilcock. As you can probably hear, I'm an Australian working in the UNICEF New York office. I am leading on our global advocacy effort on adolescent girls specifically. I was working on our global advocacy on education, and just recently have been really thrilled to take on this adolescent girls portfolio. So that involves uh, working, with colleagues right across the organization to shape, how we're going to talk about the important issue of adolescent girls, how we're going to describe what sorts of unique challenges they're facing, and what are the specific asks that we have of governments and other partners. What do we want those decision makers and those people with the power to influence to be doing to help us and others working on the ground with adolescent girls, to drive more change at scale even more quickly?
That's so interesting. So how did you get into your work with UNICEF and children's rights advocacy and specifically with adolescent girls?
Yes, so it really kicked off 13 years ago when I was in my early 30s. I was at the end of nearly 10 years of my career working in politics in Australia. I'd been a media advisor or press secretary for different ministers, and then I was working as the Deputy Chief of Staff for the Australian Environment Minister. So working more on policy advising in that role. I had a great life living in an apartment 8 minutes walk from the very famous Bondi Beach in Sydney. But
Wow.
I had this sense that I really wanted to shift into humanitarian and development work. I can't really describe it other than it was just a sense of that's what I really needed to be doing. So I quit my job. I packed up my apartment and got on a plane and flew over to Jerusalem, because a number of people had told me it was going to be more difficult to break into the industry from Sydney. What I should be doing is, going to a hub where there's different groups working on humanitarian or development issues and trying to network and make contacts and get my foot in the door that way. So that's what I did. I chose Jerusalem. And it paid off. I ended up finding, my first role, my first real humanitarian experience with UNRWA, with the UN agency that supports Palestine refugees. And from there, it's been a very rich, often challenging 13 years working for different UN agencies and nonprofits or NGOs. So after that first experience in Jerusalem, I got my master's in Brussels, and then I worked for MSF in Pakistan. It's Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières in Pakistan. I worked on the earthquake response in Nepal with the Food and Agriculture Organization, and then also with the same Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, in Myanmar after some big floods there. And then I took on a contract coordinating the communications for the World Humanitarian Summit in 2015 with the UN Development Program here in New York. So that was when I came over to New York, did a couple of years with that agency, with UNDP, and then ended up working for UNICEF. And I've worked for UNICEF for the last 6 years here in New York on advocacy. So I think a really key sort of point that I always make with this journey is that when I look back, I can see very clearly how that first step of just being brave enough and pursuing what I thought I really wanted to be doing, finding a role with uh, where I was able to make even more of a difference in the world. Taking that first step was really what made everything else possible that's followed. And I can see now how all the steps fit together. But if I hadn't gotten on that plane and gone over to Jerusalem, none of the rest of this would have happened. And since then, um, I'm so I'm just so grateful every single day that I did that. I had the courage and the self-awareness to do that. It has absolutely changed my world and my life. It's just blown open my perspective on the challenges that the world's facing and inequality and poverty and conflict. And it's brought me into contact with all sorts of people who think and sort of approach life more in the same way I do. I guess often, a bit more adventurous, willing to step out of their comfort zones to follow through on what they believe in. And I really feel like I've found my tribe in all of that. So that's been the journey.
Wow. I just need to say that that just sounds so admirable because I'm sure it must have been just so daunting to just drop everything and pursue your passion. But I think it's really inspiring to hear you say like the first step is always the most important. I'm sure like a lot of my peers here will feel the same way. So thank you so much for sharing that. And it seems like you have such extensive experience in humanitarian like action and advocacy. So I wanted to ask, like, even within that bigger sphere, what's unique about fighting for children's rights and adolescent girls' rights now that you've spent some time at UNICEF?
Yeah, plenty. I think I want to highlight three things though. The
Mhm.
first one is that particularly with children, but also with adolescent girls too, you're fighting for the rights of a group of people who are often not even recognized in official documents, policies, decisions, commitments. And that's a really tough starting point to be working from. So, to give you an example with on climate change, UNICEF going into COP28 in November last year, we were making the point that children are not sort of just mini adults when it comes to the impacts of climate change, the physical and the mental impacts.
Mhm.
They're uniquely and disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change, whether that's pollution, increased disease, obviously extreme weather events. And yet, in many of the official documents that were being fed to decision makers to help inform their thinking and then ultimately inform the outcomes and decisions that came out of COP28, in some of these documents, the word children was totally missing. And in others, the word children was maybe only mentioned once or twice. So
Mhm.
that's one huge challenge when it comes to advocating for children and for adolescent goals as well. Um, the language is really important. Obviously, the decisions are the ultimate end game, but if they're not even coming through in the language that decision makers are speaking and the language in these official documents, then their needs and experiences will never meaningfully be reflected in the decisions and where the funding goes and where the energy and impact goes. So that's one unique challenge that we face. A second unique challenge that we face is just that point around vulnerability. So this is a group, children and adolescent girls have always been a group that are heavily impacted by government policies. And I guess that's government action and inaction. But right now, when we're facing all these, particular crises and sources of instability, so economic instability, climate change, um, uh, digitalization, migration, changes in employment, that all has a really heavy impact on children and on adolescent goals. So that's another particular challenge that we face. We're constantly having to really make sure that people understand the disproportionate vulnerability that these people are facing. Um, but the third point I'll make about advocating for children and for adolescent goals, and it's a positive one, is that we're not talking about UNICEF and other agencies that advocate for children and for girls. We're not talking about us speaking on behalf of these children and young people. They are already incredibly active and determined agents of change themselves. They are already speaking out, mobilizing, demanding change right from, community level up to, um, the highest levels of sort of multilateral decision making, including here at the UN General Assembly in New York in September.
Mhm.
They are articulate, they are determined, and they are very clear on what they want decision makers to be doing. And so that's actually really uplifting and inspiring. It's clear, and there's a lot of actual research to show this, that they really are key to social transformation. They're driving innovation. They are sparking really important intergenerational dialogue. So you're getting different generations coming together to figure out how we should move forward as a global community.
Mhm.
They are defending and promoting democracy. So that's a really positive aspect of advocating on these issues.
Yeah. W- Um, yeah, I definitely recognize like that children are really vulnerable actors uniquely in like all the senses, physical, legal, social, but at the same time, I really think that there is like cause for optimism, because they are so active. And what's interesting to me is I saw that you have like experience in journalism and public policy, and all of these like comments that you're making seem to have been gathered from a very journalistic perspective, which I think is just super cool. So could you elaborate if that background kind of affects the way you approach your advocacy right now?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I mean, I certainly see, my colleagues working on advocacy here at UNICEF, we often sort of have our unique uh, sort of slightly different approaches to it based on our past experience. And this will bring me to a key point at the end of this. So in terms of the journalism, I find that background hugely valuable. I lean on it every single day. So I trained as a journalist. My undergrad was in journalism, and then I worked at a newspaper, a daily newspaper, um, as a reporter at the start of my career.
Mhm.
Where that comes in handy now is that obviously, if you're advocating on an issue, if you're trying to persuade decision makers to take action, you need to first and foremost start with an evidence base. You need to have the data to make your case about why it's urgent, um, and the cost of inaction, and also the return on investment of action. Um, but you in addition to that, complementary to that, you also need to be able to bring in the storytelling element. It's
Mhm.
not enough just to rely on the data. You have to be able to bring it back to the human impact of whatever crisis or conflict or social change you might be talking about. You need to be able to show at a really personal level how this is impacting people's lives and how different policies or innovations or investments are making a lifelong difference to these people that will carry on for generations. So that storytelling skill is really important. Um, and also, I mean, let's be frank, the UN is not known for being succinct and
Mhm.
for, necessarily finding the sharpest way to express its points of view all the time in its official documents. So it doesn't hurt to have that skill of being able to condense language and find the simple, compelling ways to say the same thing to
Mhm.
the right audiences when you need, that sort of tighter language to be used. So it definitely comes in handy there. And then on the policy side, it's really valuable to have seen the other side of the coin. So I've been sitting, in those political offices, having groups come to me to lobby me on behalf of the minister,
Wow.
and make the case for different changes or investments that they want the government to be making. So, of course, having seen that other side of the coin is really useful in my job. I've seen the competing priorities that decision makers have to wrestle with every day. I mean, they have to go in, well, in the case of Australia, in the Westminster political system, they take their individual priorities as ministers into the cabinet room and have to argue in the cabinet room for space in the sort of busy list of government priorities. So, um, it's good to, to have that background in seeing the pressure that these decision makers are under. Um, and it's a good reminder that we need to be realistic in what we're asking governments to do. We need to be ambitious, of course, but also realistic. So if you're taking an agenda to a government or asks to a government that are wildly impractical and could never be, implemented, you're not really going to get the ear of that decision maker or their team.
Mhm.
Um, and I saw the role of thought leadership and political leadership in bringing public audiences along and communities along
Mhm.
in changes in policy or, um, uh, yeah, changing sort of fiscal priorities for the governments around budget time. So seeing the role of thought leadership and being really strategic in your political leadership. So standing firm on issues when you make a judgment that it needs, the agency or the government really needs to dig in on that particular issue, or knowing when to be flexible and agile and move with the evolving landscape. I think that's a real skill that I learnt in my years in politics, and that I very much apply um, to this role now. And that brings me to that key point that I want to make, which is, I think to many people who are thinking about working as humanitarians or in development, it can seem really daunting. It can seem like you need to, have a PhD in nuclear disarmament, or to have, extensive, really specialized experience.
Mhm.
That's, of course, there are roles that need that experience, but for me, obviously, I had very transferable skills in terms of communications, political judgment,
Mhm.
um, and making being able to structure an argument that were relevant for both journalism and politics, and now my work, with the UN and also with NGOs as well.
Mhm. Wow. That is really enlightening. And I'm actually curious about what is the way that UNICEF and like the UN in general pursues its policy, its like goals the most? Is it lobbying governments and politicians, or is it like going directly to affected crisis areas? I'm just like curious about that because I know that it's hard for like an independent humanitarian group to like mobilize and get all the resources and get its messaging out like all by itself. So I was just curious.
Yeah, so I think, as a starting point, obviously our entire mandate is at UNICEF is to advocate for the rights of children.
Mhm.
And that comes under the framing of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, as an aside, is the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history.
Mhm.
Um, so, as a starting point, I mean, the whole reason for being for UNICEF is to speak out for children. But what that means, as you were just referring to, what that means in practice is many, many different forms of lobbying, of persuading,
Mhm.
of advocating. It might be much more, invisible conversations, which are not necessarily shared through newspapers or um, through social media content, but they're happening nonetheless. And it's UNICEF using its voice and its influence strategically to try to convince governments to do what we think they should be doing for children. And in other cases, it is much more public. It could involve, press releases. It could involve events. It could involve, briefings. Obviously, reports drawing on the latest data and evidence to be able to back up what we're saying needs to change and why.
Mhm.
So we draw on all sorts of different tools based on what we think would be most effective. But to your point about other organizations, I think that's really important. Even as UNICEF, we can't achieve the type of change and the vision for the future of the world that we have on our own.
Mhm.
So we also work really closely with many, many different partners, and it's a huge um, uh, contributor to the times that we are successful in driving change. It's really important. That's everything from nonprofit partners to to faith-based leaders, to other UN agencies, to philanthropy organizations, foundations. It's a really wide network, and those partnerships are really key. Even for an organization as as extensive and established as UNICEF.
Yeah. That's really amazing. Um, could you share from your personal experience something having to do with like your greatest challenges working in this field? Like I'm sure you probably like touched upon it in your previous answers, but your greatest challenges and also like the most meaningful experiences that you've had.
Sure. So in terms of challenges, I want to touch on four M's. On multiple crises, misinformation,
Mm,
momentousness, and marginalization. So, in terms of multiple crises, I mean, I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but obviously there are many, many crises which are demanding attention and action from decision makers, from climate change to economic instability. Obviously, Gaza and Ukraine and other conflicts, so that's a challenge. It means that attention is divided, resources are divided, effort is divided. So, you know, um, everyone's issues are incredibly important and urgent, but it's a real challenge to, um, sometimes to persuade decision makers to be prioritizing particular issues because they are overwhelmed with the many different crises that the world is facing right now.
mhm,
And that kind of links to momentousness, which is my second point, which is some we know as advocates that change can happen, a little bit slowly. It can take time to drive the sort of lasting change to people's lives and to communities that we need to see. But sometimes, the momentum is captured by some of the more urgent crises as they're happening, and it can be difficult to convince, um, decision makers to still prioritize investing in agendas that won't necessarily see results for a little while.
mhm,
We can provide the evidence that we will see change, but sometimes if decision makers are feeling the squeeze to be acting on something that's red hot urgent, um, sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge to make the case for investing in something where they won't see results for a longer period of time, which means there won't be, sort of political payoffs for them, etc. So that's momentousness. Um, Misinformation, obviously, we're all very aware that there is increasing amounts of misinformation being spread online. We saw it during COVID. It's a massive challenge for us, um, not only because it can be difficult for us to share accurate, reliable information and for people to get access to that, but also because it can actually increase discrimination and mental health issues amongst the groups that we're trying to support. So, for example, with adolescent girls, when there is disinformation spread, for example, about menstruation,
mm,
why it happens, what it means, what implications for sort of physical cleanliness, etc., that can expose adolescent girls to more discrimination. So misinformation is a real challenge that we are all wrestling with right now. And then the final one is marginalization. So many of uh, the groups that we're trying to advocate for are not currently at the table and involved in helping to shape the policies that will affect their lives. And that can be problematic because when these groups, including adolescent girls, are at the table, it can help to ensure that the policies that governments are implementing have far greater impact and benefit on their lives because they're aware of where some of the pitfalls might be and what might be a far more impactful investment if you're looking at two options. So that marginalization of these groups from the decision-making process is also a real challenge. Um, So that, yeah, that's four particular challenges that I wanted to highlight there. And then I think you asked about stories.
Yes, like a meaningful experience that you've had.
Yeah. So let me give you two really quickly. One is from when I was working with Doctors Without Borders in Pakistan. Obviously it's a medical organization, so I was working in communications for MSF there. I was visiting a hospital that MSF was supporting, and I came up to a cot that was in one of the rooms, and it had two little babies in it.
Hmm.
One was very plump, the most adorable, sort of big round baby cheeks, big round baby arms,
Yeah.
all the little wrinkles. And it was a boy, and he was sound asleep, looked like he'd just had a great meal, and was having really sweet dreams. And then the other baby in the same cot was really skinny. It was a girl. It was his sister. Her legs were really thin, much more bony. She didn't, her leg didn't fill the hole in the leg hole in the diaper.
Oh my God.
It was so skinny, and she was wide awake, and she had these big dark eyes. They had sort of coal, lining them, and she was staring up at me and then looking over at her brother. She was wide awake, and yeah, it was his sister, and it was explained to me
Wow.
that it was quite likely that the family was giving more food to the boy child to give him, more advantage. And that just struck me. That image really stuck with me because, I mean, this girl, she couldn't even talk or walk, um, and she was already facing an uphill battle to get the nutrition that she needed to grow. And so that's one example that's like I say, it's stuck in my head of the kinds of obstacles
Mhm.
that children can face right from the minute they enter the world.
Yeah.
The other story I want to share is from when I was working on the earthquake response in Nepal. I was up in a remote farming village. Many of the communities that were particularly affected were up in the hills, up in the remote areas. We walked into this village. I mean, it was destroyed. People had lost not only their food supplies when their, sort of makeshift stone outhouses imploded onto their stores of seeds, etc. But they'd also lost a lot of their livestock who'd been killed by falling stones, and they'd really lost everything, and they really didn't know how they were going to be able to feed themselves for the year ahead.
Mhm.
And yet, this woman, invited us into her hut. It had a dirt floor. It had a little kitchen on one side, it sort of had shelving cut out of the dirt, and a fire on one of those shelves. And she insisted on sharing her meal with us.
Oh.
It was some rice, it was some green leaved kind of vegetables, and it was some I think it was ox milk, or it was an animal. It was, yeah, one of those. It wasn't cow's milk, it was something else, maybe yak milk.
Mm.
um and she insisted on sharing this with us, even though she didn't have much herself. But she was, driven by this sense of hospitality
Yeah.
and generosity, and sharing what you have, no matter how little it is. And that has always stuck with me too, particularly when you hear people complaining about some of the first world problems that they might be experiencing in New York or in other cities. So
Oh
that's just a
gosh.
couple of the stories that I can share.
Yeah, no, wow, that is really significant. It really highlights how our world truly does have such harsh like challenges for certain people, but at the same time, there's so much hope because like there's people who really understand empathy and humanity, and there's like still hope out there. So finally, for the last question, I just wanted to ask you if you have any advice for what like everyday people, especially like college students with our like resources and time? Like what can we do to help like with UNICEF and other humanitarian actions?
Sure. I mean, as a general starting point, just in terms of world events, obviously everyone has a role to play. I'm sure, most of the people watching this, are aware of that, but I think it's a really important point to make. Everyone has a role to play and responsibility, I would argue, to be informed, share accurate information with their friends and family. We know that you know there's growing distrust of traditional sources of information like the media. So it's really even more important that people take that opportunity to inform friends and family who might trust them a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, counter misinformation, and just share news about what is happening in the world. I always push back really hard on this sort of quip that you hear some people say, that, oh, I don't get involved in politics, or I don't want to get into politics. It is not, most of these issues are not politics. They are about human rights. They are about equality. They're about protecting the most vulnerable. They're about peace and security. Um, Feeding hungry people. This is not politics. So I will always argue very strongly against that. And for anyone wanting to specifically, make this their career, do it. The needs are only going to grow from here. It's the Secretary General and others, UNICEF, are advocating really strongly and reminding people that humanitarian needs are growing, displacement is growing, hunger is growing, conflicts are becoming more complex and multiplying, and in some cases more entrenched. So the need for good, strategic, committed people to work as humanitarians or in international development or in peace and security, think tanks, etc. There's all sorts of branches to this tree, but the need for those people is only going to become greater. Not just for the UN, but for nonprofits, community-based organizations, etc. They're a crucial piece of the puzzle as well. So there is a role for everyone, and particularly women. I'll say that too.
Mm-hmm.
There's really clear evidence to show the importance of women in peacekeeping negotiations, in peacekeeping
Mm-hmm.
operations, etc. So um, uh, women, don't rule yourselves out. If you want to pursue this type of work, please, I encourage you to um, to find a way to get your foot in the door. And then for those who are serious about making this their career, I always encourage to them to work through a few important steps. So make sure that it is aligned with your personality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not necessarily for everyone. It is, it can be quite a challenging career path to follow. Many people in this industry are, of course, quite mobile, moving between different countries. You are also exposed to some, horrifying examples of the reality of what many people around the world are living through, and that can be tough to deal with as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to know that it aligns with your personality, it aligns with your purpose. You can't go into this for glamour or for to become filthy rich. Yeah, it has to have aligned with your purpose, because that is what will carry you through the tough, confronting experiences that you have. You need to take a panoramic vision. Take a panoramic view of all of the opportunities that are available. Like I said, there's many, many branches to this tree, not just the typical ones like the UN. And get informed, so know the pathways in. Network like crazy and have a system to follow up with and nurture those relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And then just be persistent. It's one of the absolute keys. The people who do make it into this type of work are the ones who persist and stick at it, and just don't give up after a couple of failed attempts. And then just you need to recognize that you will have to make sacrifices. You might be away from friends and family. You might miss out on people's milestones. Um, you have to, just accept and know that that is part of the deal. And then be flexible and be willing to go where the crises are and where the need is. And that might mean moving to locations that, where the living is far more restricted or um, perhaps less secure, etc. So be flexible. And I think if you follow all of those steps, you will be successful.
All right. Wow. Thank you so much for all of your advice and all of your stories. I wholeheartedly agree with especially the last part that you talked about, where it requires like persistence, but also the fact that it's humanitarian advocacy and not political. It's like it has completely everything to do with just humanity and your purpose. And I am really grateful that you're pointing that out and encouraging our generation to pursue that. So thank you so much for joining us today. And that was it from Anne Marie Wilcock. Thank you so much.
Thank you.